you ever been reading a fantasy book and just out of nowhere, an unexpected moment of horror crept in? I feel like even in the most hopeful fantasy stories, they often rely on the darkness in the margins in order to sharpen the light. And often those moments have monsters. Terrifying creatures to unsettle, terrify, and test the characters. And that's the whole theming of this list. So come on into the Captured in Words mansion, sit on down, because today I'm going to be counting down my top 10 most memorable monsters in fantasy literature. Of course, this is all subjective. These are all monsters from books that I have read, and there's a lot that I had to leave off of this list. So let me know your favorite monsters that you've read down in the comments. And to keep things interesting, I'm going to be setting 3 rules. Rule number 1, I can't pick any monsters from a book that is primarily horror. For instance, I can't pick like Pennywise or any of the Stephen King monsters. I'm strictly looking at fantasy fiction. The second rule, I'm not going to be simply saying basic things like vampires or dragons. I'm looking at specific examples from books that I've read. I'm going to be going over some of the lore, some of their abilities, and whatnot. And rule number 3, only 1 monster per series. As tempting as it would be to just talk about Tolkien monsters, maybe I'll do that in a future video, but for this one I'm just gonna stick to 1 monster per series so that we have a variety. Now I am gonna try my very best to keep things as spoiler free as possible when it comes to like the main plot lines of these books. I will be describing the monsters and like their abilities, maybe some of the lore. With that out of the way, let's move on to number 10. Now, I decided to start off with one of the oldest fantasy monsters created, long before fantasy novels gave us liches, balrogs, or unspeakable void beasts. There was Grendel, a creature of shadow and silence. This is from one of the oldest surviving pieces of English literature, the epic poem Beowulf. Even after more than 1,000 years, Grendel remains one of the most unsettling monsters in all of fantasy. He arrives at night, drawn to the sound of celebration in the Hall of Heorot, where warriors feast and music echoes off the rafters. Grendel listens from the dark with quiet hatred, and Grendel is described as a creature of darkness and accursed of God. He is said to descend from Cain, the biblical figure who committed the first murder. He's this spiritual outcast marked by divine punishment and banished from joy itself. Now, though the poem never really offers a complete description of him, what we do know is really haunting. He's called a shadow stalker, an inhabitant of the borderlands, less a man and more of a presence, a manifestation of grief, jealousy, and rage. Grendel's form is vaguely humanoid, though grotesquely large, and when Beowulf eventually severs his arm in combat, the limb is described as being gnarled with bony growths and clawed like barbed steel. And it takes 4 men just to carry Grendel's severed head. Grendel is a monster of proximity. He doesn't attack from afar or behind some wall of fire. He comes into the hearth of civilization itself. He violates safety, even in a golden hall filled with loyal men, lit by firelight and lined with kin. The dark can still get in. And it's that feeling of dread creeping into comfort that defines so many great monsters in fantasy. Grendel might not be as flashy as some of the other entries on this list, but the unknown poet behind Beowulf created one of the prototypes, and that's why it deserves a spot at number 10. Now, this one's just gonna be quick, but I am slowly making my way through Malazan, Book of the Fallen. I don't talk about it much on this channel because I don't want to be pressured to like binge through the series. So I've been taking my time with these books. I'm enjoying them a lot. And obviously, there's a lot of monsters that I could mention here. One of which is actually human, I guess. There's like an army of cannibals in this series that will trample over each other like vermin and eat their own dead as they try to get to you. And it's absolutely messed up. It is a terrifying image to read. But that's not the one I'm going to include at number 9 here. Actually, the one I'm choosing is kind of simple. The blood flies. Oh, no. The blood flies have stuck with me because of how plausible they are. They feel like they could be a real threat. If you've never dived into Malazan, basically blood flies are these flies that lay eggs in your skin, which then kills the flesh around it as maggots eat you from the inside. It's a real fear of mine now. Maybe I should have put a content warning because it is pretty gruesome, just even thinking about that. So yeah, in a series with dragons and gods and undead, cannibal armies, and big ass hounds, and also these T-Rex with like blades instead of hands, it's the flies that terrify me. Next we have the MawMouth from the Scholomance books by Naomi Novik. If you've read these books, or even just the first one, A Deadly Education, you're probably having terrifying flashbacks right now. Basically, at their core, MawMouths are creatures of endless consumption. Rolling folds of translucent, glossy mass, and they're covered in the eyes and mouths of their victims. Tentacles writhe out to seize their prey, and when they grab hold of you, you cannot break free. Slowly, agonizingly, the MawMouth dissolves its victim into mass while leaving something even more terrifying behind: consciousness. Those that are consumed by the MawMouth, they don't just mercifully die, their minds remain intact, endlessly aware. Those that have recently been eaten will sometimes scream or beg, while long-eaten victims are kind of eerily quiet, and they like mutter and whisper. The eyes move around, sometimes making eye contact. It's very creepy. And really the most terrifying thing with the MawMouths is that someone that was consumed centuries ago are still every bit aware, every bit as in pain as the day that they were first devoured. And in this world, the wizards have confirmed that these people are still alive centuries later. The MawMouths grow larger with each victim, and for all intents and purposes, they're almost impossible to kill. Entire enclaves of powerful wizards have thrown everything they had at a MawMouth and barely scraped by. Now, these are kind of similar to the gibbering mouthers from Dungeons and Dragons, or like Shoggoth from Lovecraftian lore. I might even use some of the art from those for this, just to kind of get the point across. And man, these monstrosities are even more horrifying when you discover their origin of how they're born, and you don't really discover this until book 3, The Golden Enclave, so I'm not going to spoil anything about that here. But suffice to say, it's quite horrific and grim. Now, I wanted to choose something from Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere because Sanderson is really good at creating unique monsters and creatures and species and whatnot. I was going to choose the Steel Inquisitors from Mistborn, so I'm just going to give them an honorable mention right now because they're terrifying, but I decided to go with something that was a little less human-like. I decided to go with something from the Stormlight Archive. However, last fall for my Halloween special, I posted a top 10 creatures of the Cosmere, and maybe I'm a bit biased, but I feel like that was an underrated video. I put a lot of effort into it. Maybe go watch that after watching this one. But even narrowing it down to the Stormlight Archive, Sanderson has a whole pantheon of unsettling entities in his arsenal. The massive chitinous chasm fiends, the mysterious hive mind, the sleepless, or even the eerily detached fused. They all give off strong nightmare fuel. And then there's Odium himself even. But in the end, it had to be the Unmade. Now, I am gonna try to keep like plot points very vague here as I describe some examples of the Unmade. However, it depends on your tolerance for spoilers. This could potentially spoil some Stormlight scenes from books 1 to 4. Nothing from Wind and Truth, just up to Rhythm of War. Again, it just depends on your spoiler tolerance. Really, I'm just giving examples of what the Unmade are. But yeah, it could spoil some lore that you don't learn about until later. So if you're worried about it, just skip to the next one on this list. First of all, just the title alone, The Unmade, sounds so cool and so mysterious. And the Unmade, they're not just monsters, they're these ancient, semi-divine entities, splinters of Odium himself, a twisted spren, each one warped into something grotesque. You can't really fight these with a shard blade, they're more so forces. Eldritch manifestations of chaos, grief, warlust, and obsession. They're all different from each other. Some are cunning, some are feral, some don't really seem to have minds at all. But they all warp reality just by being nearby. I'm gonna go over some quick examples here. A Shirtmarn, the heart of the revel. Now, this is an Unmade that appears as this throbbing heart, this black heart the size of a building that's growing tendrils into a corrupted Oathgate platform, and it's beating to an irregular rhythm. That alone is messed, but its presence leads people to indulge in the excess. It turns an entire city into a mindless party zone, feasts and endless celebration, people abandoning their lives until everyone starves, collapses, or tears each other apart. Which, now that I think about it, kind of reminds me of that mysterious dancing plague of 1518. Man, the Middle Ages were a wild time. Then we have Norgal. This is another Unmade, and it's an entity of warlust and power, a thing that slithers over the battlefield, making you love the slaughter, not just want it, but crave it and need it. And then there's Molak, who grants death rattles, visions of the future spoken by the dying. At first, it seems like it's just haunting prophetic nonsense, but then things kind of make sense. Every whispered rattle is a clue to something deeper going on Roshar. Anyways, the idea of these entities, these Unmade, lurking beneath the surface of every major conflict in the series is deeply disturbing, and their influence is insidious. It's easy to miss at first, but once you start to connect the dots, you realize the impact these entities have on the world of Roshar. Now, the next monster comes from the King Killer Chronicle by Patrick Rothfuss, and there's a few interesting creatures in this series. There's the demon spider-like creatures called the Scrael. There's the giant lizards, the wingless dragons who breathe blue fire called the Dracus. And then of course there is the Chandrian, and I almost went with the Chandrian for this list. These are 7 eerie mythical figures who seem to trail death, silence, and blue fire wherever they go, and they're kind of the central mystery of the King Killer Chronicle, the long shadow behind Kvothe's tragic tale. But if the Chandrian are the lurking evil in the background, then the Cthaeh is something far more dangerous. Now, we're not introduced to the Cthaeh until Book 2, The Wise Man's Fear, so if you don't want to know anything about this creature, feel free to skip ahead to the next entry on this list. But the Cthaeh is a being that lives inside of a tree in the Fey realm. And make no mistake, this is no kindly forest spirit or woodland oracle. This is a creature that is so vile, so ruinous in its influence, that the Fey themselves themselves have built their culture around containing it. The Scythe, or the Sith as Rothfuss pronounces it, kill anyone who speak to the Cthaeh. They even kill the birds who land on the corpse, because the slightest contact could be enough to poison the entire world. Contact with the Cthaeh turns you into an arrow of destruction shooting into the future. Let me explain. The Cthaeh is an entity that doesn't lie, but it knows far too much, and that's what makes it terrifying. It speaks truth with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, peeling back your delusions and insecurities, forcing you to see yourself exactly as you are. It sees every possible future branching out from every possible choice, and it always says the one thing that will lead you to the worst possible outcome. Not just for you, but for everyone. It wants to cause the most amount of destruction that it can. And the scariest part is that you can never truly know if what you do afterwards was your own decision, or if you were merely the next domino to fall. Now, Rothfuss never describes the Cthaeh's appearance. It's just a voice in a tree within a clearing in the Fey realm. And somehow, this is so much worse. There is some, serpentine descriptions of its movements and its speech patterns, so we can imagine it's some type of serpent within the tree. That sounds very original. But the horror here isn't about the physical attributes of this creature. It's existential. It gets under your skin and it stays there. And after this encounter with the Cthaeh, we discover that being bitten by this creature is very, very bad. And Rothfuss never really tells us what the bite does, but he doesn't have to, because your mind fills in the rest. And that's really the genius of this creature. The more you think about it, the scarier it becomes. It's kind of the ultimate narrative trap, because if you end your own life to stop the damage that it might cause, that might be exactly what it wanted. If you try to resist it, it knew that you would resist it. Every choice you make might already be part of its plan, and the plan always ends in tragedy. Now, fans, myself included in many theory videos that I've made, have speculated that the Cthaeh has been behind some of the worst disasters in the world's history. The betrayal of Lanray, the shattering of the moon, maybe even the fall of the Amir. And if all of this is true, then Kvothe's meeting with it, it's likely the reason why in the present narrative, in the present day, where we're following Kvothe in this inn telling his story, it's kind of a tragedy. He seemed to have caused a lot of chaos in the world, and it likely all stems from his encounter with the Cthaeh. And the best part is that the Cthaeh barely does anything. It just talks to him. There's no magic battle, there's no carnage, just a quiet voice in a tree that knows everything and wants only the worst for you. Honestly, it's one of the most unsettling creatures because of the psychological horror that it puts you through as you question all of your actions after encountering it. And that's why it's one of my favorite monsters, and it deserves a spot on this list. For the next one, we're going to look at the Wheel of Time. Now, Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time has many unexpected moments of horror, and even the very first scene where we meet the Trollocs, or the first time they visit Shadar Logoth, which was very spooky, or even moments involving Padan Fain in The Great Hunt, for instance. The Wheel of Time has a bunch of very creepy creatures with its shadow spawn. I mean, take the Fades, for instance. I assumed that the Fades were going to be, one of the scariest things in the Wheel of Time. However, there's enough baddies that the Murdral actually seem commonplace after a while. and I mean, they're pretty horrific when they're first introduced. Now, there's also Machin Shin, an entity that resides in the Ways, whose name in the Old Tongue means the Black Wind. Now, the Ways are this area outside of reality that was crafted by magic users long ago, where different pathways will help you travel long distances and connect you to stone doorways called waygates. And Machin Shin is this darkness that lives within the Ways. You know of its arrival by a light wind and hearing thousands of screaming voices, which might manifest as a rambling monologue obsessed with blood, screams, violence, and terror. And truly, it's enough to make people go mad. It's described as stealing minds and souls and leaving survivors empty husks. Robert Jordan has claimed that it eats the souls and memories of the people that it catches. Again, absolutely terrifying, and this is why the Ways have now become unsafe to travel, obviously. The exact nature of Machin Shin is unknown, as are its origins. However, Machin Shin is still just an honorable mention, as there's a monster in the series that I actually want to highlight that I think is a little more terrifying. Especially since to avoid Machin Shin, maybe just don't go in the Ways. What I think is the creepiest shadow spawn in the books is the Gholam. Not Gholam, Gholam. These creatures are impossibly strong, fast, and agile, with an immunity to the One Power, which is the magic system in the Wheel of Time. Basically, these are killing machines. They live off fresh blood and rip a body to shreds. Now, Gholam look human at a glance. They're slender and pale, but beneath the facade is something utterly inhuman. They have no bones, no blood, no organs, and they can squeeze through cracks the width of a hand and twist their bodies like wet cloth. Now, the Gholam were crafted for a singular nightmarish purpose, and that was to hunt and kill the Aes Sedai, which are the magic users. Now, only 6 of them were ever made because even the Forsaken were afraid of what they had unleashed. So basically, they're like the Terminator of fantasy, but also like a squishy octopus-like vampire. They can sense channelers from miles away, and they feel when the power is being used. And even worse, they enjoy it. Killing someone who can channel fills them with this kind of ecstatic euphoria. And like I said, they live on blood, tearing their victims apart with impossible strength and speed. A Gholam is basically an apex predator that renders magic useless, mocks human anatomy, and feeds on the lifeblood of the powerful. And that's why I think it's the most terrifying monster in the Wheel of Time, other than like the Dark One himself. When it comes to monsters, Tolkien's Legendarium has no shortage of unforgettable nightmares. I can make an entire video just on Tolkien's monsters. Maybe I will at some point. From the skeletal grasp of the Barrow-wights, to the formless, nameless things crawling in the roots of the world, to Mother of the Spiders of Mirkwood, Shelob, let alone Ungoliant, or the haunting presence of the Ringwraiths. Middle-earth is home to horrors that often feel older than myth itself. But for me, the one creature that's always stood above the rest, towering, smoldering, and wrapped in shadow, that title belongs to the Balrog, the Flame of Udun, Durin's Bane. Man, the moment the Fellowship reaches the depths of Moria, the tone of the story kind of shifts. It becomes darker, more claustrophobic, and you can practically hear the stone pressing in. And then comes the discovery of the Book of Mazarbul, the final words of a doomed people. Drums in the deep, we cannot get out. The shadow moves in the dark, we cannot get out. They are coming. Even as a kid, reading these absolutely ominous lines for the first time gave me chills. And then the drums begin, echoing from the deeps, and you know something terrible is coming, and you're right. When the Balrog finally appears, Tolkien barely describes it, and that's part of what makes it so terrifying. We're told that it is like a great shadow, in the middle of which was a dark form of man shape maybe, yet greater. Fire and smoke pour from its body, its mane blazing behind it like a comet's tail. It holds a sword like a tongue of flame in one hand, and in the other, a whip with many thongs that crack through the dark like thunder. This is Durin's Bane, the ancient horror that slew the king of Khazad-dûm and drove the dwarves from their greatest city. For centuries, it slept beneath the mountains, waiting, and when it wakes, even the orcs flee. Honestly, what makes the Balrog so terrifying isn't just its raw power, it also has a lot of magical power to it as well, but it's more so what it represents. This is a corrupted Maiar, an immortal spirit that chose to serve Morgoth, Middle-earth's original Dark Lord. And if you don't know, Gandalf himself is a Maiar, so if he chose to follow the Dark Lord, he could have become like a Balrog. And in a world where power is often tied to moral clarity, think Aragorn, Gandalf, Galadriel, the Balrog is the inverse of this, a being of immense might, utterly consumed by shadow and fire. And yet even it is not invincible. Gandalf, one of the most powerful beings in Middle-earth, faces it alone on the bridge of Khazad-dûm. He plants his staff, stands between the darkness and the light, and says, "You cannot pass." Or, "You shall not pass," depending on if you're reading the book or watching the movie. And for a moment, the shadow stops. What follows is one of the most iconic duels in fantasy, a battle that rages across the bridge, down into the deep, and up to the peak of Zirakzigil, where the wizard and the Balrog fight for 3 days and 2 nights. Gandalf gives his life to defeat this Balrog, the most terrible of Morgoth's servants. So that's the kind of monster that we're dealing with. Even when you win, you fail. And yes, there's greater evils in Tolkien's world. Of course, there's Morgoth, Sauron, Ungoliant, but the Balrog is one of the most memorable in the books because of how it's used. It's a thing of fire and fear, but also history. The Balrog is the past, the buried trauma of the First Age, rising up to remind the world that old evils never truly die. And sometimes when you dig too deep, they find you. Now, I was thinking of putting Shelob on this list, however, there's a spider in fantasy that is much more terrifying in my opinion, and that leads me to the next one. If you haven't read Perdido Street Station by China Miéville, it is entirely insane. One of the weirdest books you can read, and I highly recommend reading it. Now, at first, I was going to add the Slake Moths to this list. They are truly terrifying. I remember reading Perdido and thinking it was a great book. Then the Slake Moths showed up, and it was sort of like the flood level of the first Halo game. You're just plunged straight into horror mode with little warning at all. And there's so many great, weird moments like this. So yeah, it is a great book. It's a fantastic book. The Slake Moths are these weird, winged species that exist in several extra-dimensional planes simultaneously, making them very difficult to kill. And they feed on the consciousness of sentient creatures. They're one of the most horrifying things that Miéville has created. However, I also thought about adding Mr. Motley to this list, but then I remembered a monstrosity that is even more terrifying than these, and that is the Weaver. Now, to put into perspective how horrifying these creatures are, I need to give you a little bit of context. So during the events of Perdido Street Station, Mayor Rudgutter of New Crobuzon needs help in combating the threat of the Slake Moths. And the characters in this book are looking for answers, they're almost out of options, so they decide to literally contact Hell for help.
What?
But they end up getting denied, and therefore they have no other option but to talk to the Weaver. literal hell was a preferable alternative to contacting the Weaver. But apparently even demons can have nightmares, and they want nothing to do with the Weaver. Now, that build-up is how you know that you're dealing with something truly horrifying. And thankfully, or perhaps unfortunately, when the reader encounters the Weaver, it doesn't disappoint. Weavers are an extra-dimensional race of creatures that have a physical appearance resembling that of a spider, but it features a unique set of appendages with small, human-like hands at each end. And appearances alone make this nightmare fuel, but it's the abilities of these entities that are the true nightmare. The ultimate goal of a weaver is to improve what is called the world weave, an omnipresent tapestry upholding everything. And a weaver is the only thing that can see this world weave, making its behavior practically impossible to understand to anybody else. The weaver makes choices based on what it finds aesthetically pleasing, and this can seem to change at any moment. Old stories would tell how weavers would kill each other over aesthetic disagreements, such as whether it was prettier to destroy an army of 1,000 men or to leave it be, or whether a particular dandelion should or should not be plucked. For a weaver, to think was to think aesthetically. To act, to weave, was to bring about more pleasing patterns. They did not eat physical food. They seemed to subsist on the appreciation of beauty. Now, weavers communicate telepathically by riddle, but communicating with them at all is dangerous because of how they're constantly changing interests. For instance, they might suddenly get a fascination with collecting scissors or ears. There's literally a scene where a weaver just decides it wants the left ear of everybody, and it collects them simply because it wanted to. Now, due to its alien intelligence, the Weaver is one of the few known creatures in Baslag impervious to the effects of the Slake moth. In the book Iron Council, one man encounters a Weaver and ends up becoming a mad spider prophet that babbles nonsense. So even their presence can make you go mad. Now, something I find kind of interesting here is, in a way, this eldritch cosmic horror can kind of be seen as a stand-in for the author, China Miéville himself, and I don't mean that as an insult. The way that it can craft reality to its own liking, and how it can literally pick the characters up and take them to the next stage of the plot. The way their minds are so focused on aesthetics and beauty, like an artist painting over their old work when inspiration strikes them, or a writer revising and revising each sentence until it sounds a little more beautiful. There's almost this self-mocking tone when it comes to the Weavers, which is why I wonder if this was an intentional, author insert. Regardless, it's still a terrifying creature that deserves a high spot on this list. If you have read The Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe, then you know how difficult it is to describe this book. It is dense, it's layered with symbolism, and it really only starts to make sense on a second read or maybe a third read. I've been wanting to make videos on this series, but I just feel like I'm not quite qualified yet. I need to read it again. Now, this is science fiction disguised as fantasy, or maybe the other way around. Because of that, I feel like I could include it on this list. Now, within this surreal world, one of the most chilling creatures I've read in literature is the Alzabo. At first glance, this is a massive alien bear-like predator with claws sharp enough to tear through bone. But the true terror lies in what it does to those that it devours. When it eats a person or a creature, it absorbs those mannerisms and those memories and those voices. It learns the person's voice that it consumes, and I think you can see where I'm going with this. Imagine hearing your child's voice outside the door after dark, saying, "Father, can't you help me?" Only for a second voice, higher, wrong somehow, to join in and say, "Let me in, mother." The voices sound real, they sound familiar, and that's the point. The Alzabo is using your own memories, your own loved ones, to get you to open the door, and that's something that actually happens in the book. It was so messed up. Now, Gene Wolfe kind of leaves it ambiguous whether this is some type of mimicry or if some parts of that person still exists after being devoured, kind of like the MawMouths from Scholomance. It could be that a part of the victim remains conscious within the Alzabo, we don't really know. So either the Alzabo is an intelligent manipulator weaponizing grief, or it's a walking prison of souls, with its victim still aware, still trapped, and calling out the maw of this monster. Both options are horrible. We also learn about this whole ritual thing with the Alzabo. I won't get into it because of spoilers. You should go read Book of the New Sun. Now, where this creature came from, its origins are kind of uncertain. Wolfe just says he describes it as being alien and coming from a cold, distant world. But in a story so drenched in forgotten history, we don't really need to know where it came from because it's effective at what it's trying to do, which is terrify us. After reading about the Alzabo, you might not want to answer the door ever again, and that's why it gets a high spot on this list. Okay, for the next one, let me just describe what we're dealing with here. It towers at over 3 meters, its entire body an arsenal of polished chrome and serrated death, 4 arms tipped with scalpel blade fingers, rows of glittering teeth, skin like mirrored razors, and in its glowing red eyes, the cold, unfeeling gaze of something ancient, something mechanical, and utterly unknowable. This is a description of the Shrike from Dan Simmons' Hyperion Cantos. Quite possibly the single most unsettling creature in science fiction literature. And yes, this is sci-fi, so I'm kind of cheating with this entry a little bit. While it is technically sci-fi, it does kind of have a gothic tone to it. It deals with time-twisting metaphysics. It focuses on religion, fate, and myth. Hyperion bleeds into the realm of fantasy for sure. And nothing better embodies that bleeding edge between genres than the Shrike. The Shrike is a weapon of the far future sent backward through time via the time tomes, and the Shrike doesn't really have a clear motive, it doesn't explain itself, it appears when it wants, kills without warning, and then disappears back into the fabric of space-time like a cosmic predator slipping between dimensions. But perhaps its most famous calling card is the Tree of Pain. And this isn't a metaphor, the Tree of Pain is a real structure in these books. Miles tall and thorned like some barbed wire crucifixion device. This tree is what the Shrike impales its victims on. And they don't die, not right away. They live suspended in agony, skewered through with metallic spikes. Some for hours, and others for eons. So it's kind of a horror through the lens of eternity. A punishment without context and suffering without salvation. And obviously, because of how haunting this is, the Shrike holds a lot of psychological weight throughout the Hyperion Cantos. The characters don't just fear it, they obsess over it, they dream of it, they're changed by it. Religious cults form around it, believing it to be the avatar of divine retribution. Others think it's the harbinger of humanity's final days. Now, there are scenes in Hyperion where the Shrike kind of appears like a silent judge, just standing there motionless, watching and deciding. And then there's scenes where it explodes into motion, moving so fast it seems to blink through time, gutting entire battalions before the second hand ticks. Its presence haunts the story like a spiritual parasite, uninvited and irreversible. If you're looking for one of the most terrifying monsters monsters and you don't mind sci-fi, then you found it. You should read Hyperion. And there we have my top 10 monsters in fantasy fiction. Let me know all of your favorites in the comments. I'm sure there is a ton of them that I didn't include. As always, a massive thank you to all my patrons, my channel members, and those who help out on Ko-fi. You guys make these videos possible, and I want to give a special shout out to one of my most recent patrons, Tony Hodge. Thank you so much for the support, and I'll see you soon with another video.